The importance of getting away from a narcissistic abuser. One of the most challenging aspects in recovering from narcissistic abuse is the task of putting psychological, emotional, and sometimes physical distance between yourself and your narcissistic abuser. I've talked about the guilt and ambivalence that can sometimes emerge when beginning to separate from a narcissistic family or partner. Questions can arise like, am I making all of this up? Am I being unreasonable? Or am I being too sensitive? But there can also be something else at play that makes distance like this feel so challenging to establish. But this something else is precisely why distance is so important and ultimately beneficial for the survivor. In today's video, I want to talk about the invisible forces that can hold a narcissistically abusive system together. I think there are some pretty cool ideas in the field of personality research that shed light on these forces, and I'm going to explain what some of them are and then use them to explain why distance from the narcissistic abuser is often so necessary for recovery. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse in individual therapy and through my online course and accompanying private Facebook group community. And in both cases, we take a three-pronged approach to recovery that involves making sense of what happened, gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, and living in defiance of the narcissist rules. As you can probably already tell, today's video falls under the category of gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser. And if you were a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or a partner, then I encourage you to check out my free ebook on this topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat, and it goes into a lot of other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoated child or partner of the narcissistic abuser. It talks about certain self-limiting beliefs that might be necessary to survive this kind of abuse, and really drives home the point that all these ways of being mistreated are a direct result of the narcissistic abuser's psychological and emotional problems. That it had nothing to do with the survivor, nor is it the survivor's fault, or was it ever that person's fault. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button and turn notifications on so that you're alerted every time I post a new video. So what are the forces at play in a narcissistically abusive system? Well, the ideas I'm going to talk about are from a prominent psychologist in the mid-1900s named Kurt Lewin, who researched all the various influences that can act on an individual when they're a member of a group. And it's known as field theory, and I think it does a tremendous job of highlighting how an individual is not a lone operator in any group, but is at the same time responding to all the other people in that environment. And Lewin proposed that any single person's behavior in a group is a result of both that person's needs, wishes, and goals and desires, along with the environmental forces of the group acting upon that individual. So both the environment and the individual mold and shape each other in their interactions. And this happens at both the individual's conscious and the group's conscious and unconscious levels of experience. And I think there are three really important principles of field theory that apply to narcissistic abuse. The first is something called interdependence, and that just means that any action in a family system is both a cause and an effect in the system, so that each person acts upon and is acted upon by others. And I'm going to clarify that in a little bit. The second principle is called, it's a bit of a mouthful, contemporaneity. And it states that anyone's behavior and experience at a given point in time is the product of the immediate forces acting upon that person at that same point in time. So there's a big emphasis on the present moment. Of course, past patterns, and what happened historically have an impact, but current behavior and influence can still be traced in one way or another to what's happening in the here and now. And the third principle I'll call stability, and that just states that a system will move towards a state of stability and resist destabilizing influences. So if the individual tries to act in ways that don't contribute to the system's stability, then that system will act in ways to influence the individual to change his or her actions to be more aligned with that system's stability. Now let's apply Lewin's field theory and these principles to what it can be like for the scapegoat child in a narcissistically abusive family. So we start with the narcissistically abusive parent who feels worthless at their core but can't tolerate this feeling, so they relocate it into the scapegoated child. And the narcissistic parent wields a lot of influence over this system because he or she often possesses the most perceived authority in the family. And typically the narcissistic parent functions in a way where he or she is issuing commands and others are expected to show obedience. So the principle of interdependence that I talked about shows up because the narcissistic parent can't feel artificially better about themselves if they don't have others around to obey their orders. And the stability of the family system could very well rest on the narcissistic parent issuing orders and the other family members following those orders. So many survivors of narcissistic abuse say that they can feel this invisible pressure to be as they once were once they're back in contact with their narcissistic family of origin. And I think that that other principle of contemporaneity applies here, that in a narcissistic family system which achieves stability by accommodating the narcissistic parent's psychopathology, there's going to be tremendous contemporaneous pressures applied to the scapegoat survivor to get back into that role that contributes to the system's stability once that survivor kind of comes into contact with the system. So survivors can describe this pressure as feeling like almost a type of gravity that they experience when they're back in contact, or even thinking back on their narcissistic family. Gravity is a hard force to defy. It's kind of everywhere. And it's that similar kind of feeling that can happen for the scapegoat survivor who's back in contact with their narcissistic family. So this idea suggests that to be in contact with a narcissistic family as a scapegoat survivor also means being exposed to the interdependent forces acting on the survivor to get back into the scapegoat role, and then the pressure to keep the system stable by going along with, of course, being devalued, that is just part and parcel of being the scapegoat. And from this point of view, to be back in contact with the narcissistic family carries an extreme danger, psychologically and emotionally speaking, to the scapegoat survivor. I really think that understanding the narcissistically abusive family as a field that can envelop the scapegoat survivor could be really helpful in understanding why distance is so important. When I emphasize the importance of emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical distance from a narcissistic abuser, it's not to punish the narcissistic abuser for his or her wrongs. I think it's really just a matter of practicality, that in order to recover from chronic narcissistic abuse throughout one's childhood, it's often necessary to remove oneself from that emotional contagion that works to keep the survivor from separating from this system, which necessarily puts that survivor down so much. The scapegoat survivor's beliefs of being defective or undeserving cannot be disconfirmed while operating within this type of system, because too many forces would get applied to prevent the survivor from doing this, because it'd be too challenging to the stability of that system. Well, here's another anonymized case example of how distance from a narcissistically abusive family worked for one young man. Again, completely anonymous and fictionalized example, but I think it really brings the point home. So we'll call this guy Stephen, who was a man in his 30s, coming to therapy complaining of a pervasive feeling of anxiety in just about everything he did. And his therapist quickly diagnosed him as a scapegoat to a very narcissistic father, and saw Stephen's self-criticism and difficulties accessing feelings of pride as actually adaptations to the narcissistic family Stephen was born into. And Stephen's therapist would express her astonishment and compassion at the cruelty shown to Stephen by his father, and would tacitly encourage Stephen to put distance between himself and his father. Well, at first, Stephen had difficulty feeling the same sense of indignation at how his father treated him than what his therapist was showing. I mean, he was used to it and still close enough to the field of his narcissistic family that he had difficulty seeing the unfairness of the system to him. At the same time, something deep within him seemed to tell him that his therapist was right, and he began to limit the amount of contact he had with his father. And at first, his father and the other family members employed tactics to get Stephen to come back to the family. And in this case, it involved sending him messages that accused him of hurting his father, of Stephen thinking he was better than them, and even questioning Stephen's sanity. And so he worked to pay less and less attention to these messages, eventually deleting them before even reading them. The next year was difficult for Stephen, no question. He'd often feel disoriented, empty, sometimes profoundly sad, and often as though he was doing something very, very wrong. But in the meantime, however, he was slowly but surely finding new fields for himself in his life. He was seeing friends more often who treated him well, and he began dating with an eye towards partners who showed him kindness and who possessed a sense of stability and worth independently in themselves. And by the end of this year, he could look at his professional and personal achievements and give himself credit for them. And this was a feeling and experience that was fairly new to him, as it had been strictly forbidden in the narcissistic family he grew up in. Well, I think Stephen's case demonstrates the process and importance of separating from the narcissistic family's field and finding new fields for yourself that nourish and strengthen you. And I hope that this video offers an understanding of the impact of narcissistic abuse that might make gaining distance from the abusive system feel more justified to you. You know, it's not an act of revenge or hostility to the narcissistically abusive family system nor its members, but I think a really radical and important act of self-care towards oneself. And I think that the principles of field theory support this. Well, again, thanks for watching today. I hope that this idea of the field and this sort of like way, it's almost like the air one breathes, kind of happens when one is in the midst of a narcissistic family's field, is kind of underlines or underscores why it's so important to kind of extricate oneself from that field, so you're sort of breathing different air. And I think it's important because it's not just sort of arguing with oneself that I need to be away, and sort of like, having a war of thoughts in one's mind. It's the actual act of kind of not having contact, because that really is what experientially lets one system know that you're no longer in that field and that it's over time possible to inhabit new fields. Again, not the only thing to happen in recovery, but I think one of the three foundational parts of recovery. Okay. Thank you, and I really look forward to posting next week. And again, as I like to say, I really appreciate everybody's support of this channel and the videos and your comments. Please continue submitting any ideas you have for videos that you'd like to see. I intend to kind of make that more of a focus going forward. And again, it's just always a pleasure to post, and I'll see you all next Sunday. Take care.